Hey guys, so we have these conversations today about women in the church. Many of you are no doubt aware that perhaps the biggest argument against women being able to be pastors or elders in the church or able to preach is simply that the Bible forbids it. And the passage used most often to rule women out of leadership is the words of Paul in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 2. Now, at the time Paul wrote this letter, about 50 AD, he was headquartered in Ephesus, in ancient Greece, though today that's modern Turkey. But when he wrote this letter, he was away on a trip, and he's left Timothy in charge of the church there in Ephesus, so he writes him this letter. Let me read you the passage, and then we'll explore what Paul is really talking about here. This is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 15. It is my desire that men everywhere pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or arguments, and that in the same way the women adorn themselves in modest apparel and with self-control, not with hair plaited with gold and pearls or with the most expensive clothing, but with the kind of good works which make sense for a woman who professes reverence for God's goodness. Let a woman learn in quietness and submission. I do not permit a woman to be teaching or having authority over a man, but to be in quietness. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and fell into transgression. Nevertheless, the women will be kept safe through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. So in the modern church, this passage has been used to say that women must stay in their quiet place and that they are certainly prohibited from preaching, leading, pastoring, etc. This has been the absolute go-to passage on this topic. The question is, are we sure that's what's going on in this passage? Now, we already know that first century Roman culture was very patriarchal. So yes, there was what you might call a natural drift toward mostly male leadership in the early church. But you have to balance that with the fact that Jesus absolutely elevates women in his ministry and arranges for them to be the first witnesses of the resurrection. Then we have women deacons in the book of Acts, the reference in the book of Acts to Philip's 4 daughters who prophesied in the church, Paul's reference in 1 Corinthians 11 to women speaking in church, and Paul's reference at the end of Romans to a woman named Junia, who he calls an apostle. When you factor all those in, what you have is a church in a mostly patriarchal culture that is elevating women in a countercultural way. To me, this totally makes sense because as much as the church was situated in a patriarchal culture, they also understood that the gospel was like the great equalizer of humanity, right? Think of Paul's words in Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. But even with all that, a lot of people go back to this 1 Timothy passage and they say, no women teaching, no women leading. The problem is that that extremely restrictive view of 1 Timothy 2 seems out of sync with all this other elevation of women we find in the New Testament. So are we missing something in how we read 1 Timothy 2? Actually, we are, and it's big. Remember I said that when Paul wrote 1 Timothy, he was headquartered in Ephesus? Well, Ephesus was home to number 2 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which was the temple of the goddess Artemis, also known as Diana. And right at the same time Paul is ministering there in Ephesus, a Greek guy named Xenophon writes a love story known as the Ephesiaka, which was actually one of Shakespeare's inspirations 1,500 years later for Romeo and Juliet. Well, we learn from the Ephesiaka, from Xenophon's Ephesiaka, that the women of Ephesus would wear this very specific hairstyle where they would have gold and pearls braided into their hair to show their devotion to the goddess Artemis. Sound familiar? It's the exact hairstyle Paul is describing in 1 Timothy 2. He's not saying, don't have nice hair. He's saying, don't wear your hair in this way that signifies devotion to this false goddess, but instead adorn yourself with good deeds that reflect the goodness of Christ. We also learn from Xenophon's Ephesiaka tale that young women in Ephesus, unlike a lot of the Roman Empire, were not trained to learn in quietness, but were trained from a young age in the temple through loud prayers and recitations to promote the Artemis myth, which was that Artemis, the goddess Artemis, was the mother of all life, and that it was not woman who brought sin into the world, but man. And people came from all over the world to visit the temple of Artemis and to hear these presentations. So when Paul says that these women in the Ephesian church need to dial it back, and he specifically references Adam being formed first and Eve being deceived, he's not laying down some governing theology about women. What he's doing is he's pushing back on the Artemis myth and telling them to stop promoting it in the church. Then you get to the end of the 1 Timothy passage and you come to the statement that has most puzzled Bible scholars, where Paul says that women, quote, will be kept safe through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness. It's weird because it seems like a thought out of the blue. And so what is Paul saying? That only women who have enough faith or holiness will be kept safe in childbirth? Well, if you still doubt that this whole passage is Paul pushing back on the Artemis myth and how these young women have been taught to wrap their whole lives in thinking around it, from their hairstyles to the idea of female superiority, listen to this. In mythology, Artemis was the daughter of Zeus, and because she helped her mother Leto deliver her brother Apollo, she became known as the goddess of childbearing. And so the social pressure on women was that if I don't remain loyal to the goddess, I'm going to die during childbirth. So what's so beautiful in this passage is that Paul is saying to these young Ephesian women, listen, you don't have to dress and wear your hair like the goddess, and I don't allow women to come into the church and teach that woman is the author of man. By the way, that part where Paul says women cannot teach or have authority over man, that can be translated as teaching that woman is the author of man. And you don't have to be afraid you're going to die during childbearing, because what you've been taught, that how your labor and delivery goes depends on your loyalty to Artemis, well, it just simply isn't true. If anything, Paul is pulling these women back from the female superiority of the Artemis myth to the equality of men and women. And he's setting them free from the ways the Artemis myth controlled their lives and kept them in fear. So once you understand the backdrop for Paul's words to the young women of Ephesus, if you ask, so what does this passage have to do with an overall theology of women in the church, in ministry and leadership? You find that the answer is absolutely nothing. By the way, if you do believe that women can't teach, preach, pastor, or lead in certain ways, I think it's also worth asking this question. Why would God say that? Because if you actually try to answer that question, it's kind of embarrassing. Is it because women are not smart enough or not capable enough? Who in the year 2024 thinks that's a credible argument? So what makes sense to me is that the church should follow the trajectory that was obvious in the early church, a trajectory of increasingly elevating women, even though surrounded by a largely patriarchal culture. My guess is that in the early church, wanting to gain a hearing for the gospel, they were careful about elevating women too much for fear of offending the sensibilities of the non-Christians around them. The irony for us today is that we are in exactly the opposite situation, where the culture around us is increasingly recognizing the full equality of women, and it's actually Christians and churches that are resisting it. In our situation, keeping women second class will hurt the spread of the good news of Jesus. So now you understand why at LifeSpring we say that alongside men, women can minister and lead in accordance with whatever ways God has gifted and called them, and why we want to teach girls, just like boys, that they can grow up to be whoever and whatever God made them to be. And I would argue that this view is the one that is most faithful to the heart of God and most faithful to the trajectory of the New Testament. So hey, thanks for listening. This is one of those topics where as soon as we start talking about it, somebody brings out the Bible and uses it to keep women in a certain place. So it's important for us to think deeply about it. Here at LifeSpring Church, we have lots of women giving leadership and doing all kinds of ministry, and our church is so much richer for their contributions. Why would we not want that?